The night in a medieval town was never truly quiet. The wind whispered through crooked alleyways, carrying with it the smell of smoke, damp wood, and something far less pleasant that clung to every corner of the streets. Lanterns flickered faintly against stone walls, their lights stretching long shadows that seemed to bend and watch you as you walked. To us, the past may seem like an old story told in books, but if you had stepped into one of those towns, you would have quickly learned how heavy and alive the night really was. Most people imagine the Middle Ages as knights in shining armor, kings in castles, and fair maidens singing in high towers. But the truth is far rougher, and it is hidden not in the castles, but in the streets below them. It is here, in the twisting roads that smelled of mud and sweat, where the stories of survival unfolded. And among the many places that tell us about medieval life, few are as misunderstood, as whispered about, and as dangerous as the brothels that lit up the night. At first, you might think of them as places of laughter, dancing, and candlelight. Perhaps a bit of wine, a bit of music, maybe even merriment. But the reality was much darker, much colder, and far less forgiving. For most people, stepping inside a medieval brothel was less about pleasure and more about survival, desperation, and the harshness of a world that gave little mercy. You would not have lasted a night there, not because of the things you imagine, but because of everything else you never thought about. Picture yourself arriving at such a place. The door is low, the wood rough, the sign above it creaking in the wind. Inside, the air is thick, too thick, filled with the smell of unwashed bodies, sour wine, and damp straw. The floorboards groan under your weight, and the fire in the corner barely warms the room. Your eyes adjust slowly, and you begin to notice faces, tired, watchful, some painted with a smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. Everyone here is playing a role, because in a medieval brothel, roles were the only way to survive. The women who worked there were not the glittering figures of fantasy. They were human, painfully human, carrying stories etched into their faces, stories of famine, war, loss, and choices made in desperation. Some are younger than you'd think, sent there because their families could not feed them. Others were older, their faces hardened by years of surviving in a place that demanded more than anyone should ever give. And every one of them carried secrets that could cut deeper than a knight's blade. The customers, too, were not what you might expect. There were no charming nobles tossing gold around with ease. Instead, the faces in the firelight were weary men from the fields, merchants passing through, soldiers carrying scars that could never heal, and drifters whose names no one remembered. They came with coins clutched tight, not always enough to pay, and with desires that often had nothing to do with romance. Many sought only warmth, a roof, a bit of company to hold back the loneliness of the dark. But others came with cruelty, and those nights were the worst of all. And then there was you. Imagine sitting there, listening to the low hum of voices, watching the flicker of shadows across the walls. The door shuts behind you, and suddenly the outside world feels far away. This is no place for a visitor, no place for someone unprepared. You might think you could endure it, but the truth is, even a single night here could change you. The danger is not only in the fights that sometimes broke out, or the diseases whispered about in hushed tones. The true danger was how quickly you could lose yourself, how the darkness of the place could wrap itself around you until you no longer recognized who you were. The keeper of the house, often a woman older than the rest, watched everything with sharp eyes. She knew who had paid, who hadn't, who was causing trouble, and who was worth keeping close. Her word carried weight because in this house, she held the rules. Step out of line, and you'd find yourself thrown back into the street, sometimes bloodied, sometimes worse. Survival meant staying unnoticed, quiet, and careful. Outside, the streets of the medieval town seemed dangerous enough. Pickpockets, drunks, guards who demanded bribes. But inside, in the low glow of a brothel, the danger was different. It wasn't loud or obvious. It was subtle, like the way people's eyes lingered on you a little too long, or the silence that fell when a stranger walked in. You'd feel in your chest, the heavy weight of knowing you didn't belong, that you were a guest in a place that did not welcome guests. And as the night stretched on, the brothel revealed its secrets. The laughter was thin, the smiles fleeting, the promises empty. Behind closed doors, the air grew colder, not warmer. You began to see the cracks in the walls, the hopelessness in the glances exchanged, the truth that this was not a place of comfort, but a cage. Every sound, the creak of the stairs, the cough in the corner, the sudden slam of a door, reminded you that danger never truly slept here. But just as you began to think you understood the weight of it, something else stirred. A stranger entered, his cloak heavy with rain, his face hidden in the shadows. The room grew quiet, too quiet, as if everyone knew something you did not. The keeper's eyes narrowed, the laughter died, and the fire seemed to burn lower. You could not yet tell what he wanted, or why everyone shifted uncomfortably at his presence. But one thing was certain. The night had only just begun, and already you were in far deeper than you had ever intended. The stranger's boots struck the floor with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Each step sounded too loud, too sharp, in a place where most people tried to move softly, as if afraid to disturb the fragile balance of the room. His cloak dripped with rain, leaving a dark trail across the uneven boards. No one spoke, no one welcomed him, but no one dared ask him to leave either. That silence told you more about him than words ever could. You glanced around, trying to read the faces in the flickering firelight. The regulars lowered their eyes, pretending to be busy with their mugs, or simply staring into the smoke that curled upward toward the rafters. The women leaned back slightly, shoulders stiff, watching carefully but keeping their distance. Even the keeper, whose voice usually cut through the noise with ease, remained still, her lips pressed tight. Whatever this man carried with him, it wasn't just the rain. For a moment, you wondered if this was just how nights went here. Unpredictable, filled with sudden shadows. But then you remembered the world outside these walls. In the Middle Ages, life itself was fragile. A single winter could starve a village, a single wound could end a life, and a single wrong step could change your fate forever. The brothel was not separate from that world. It was an extension of it, compressed into one dim room. Survival was always the first rule. Your stomach tightened as you realized how unprepared you were. You had walked in imagining curiosity, maybe even a kind of storybook mystery. But now, you were beginning to understand. In a medieval brothel, you could not simply be a visitor. You were already part of the story, whether you wished to be or not. The stranger lowered his hood, and the firelight caught his face. It was lean, hollowed by travel, his eyes sharp in a way that made you feel as if he had already measured and judged every soul in the room. His jaw was tight, his beard untrimmed, and a thin scar ran from his temple to his cheek. You didn't need to know his name to understand that he carried danger like a cloak. He moved to the fire, stretching his hands as though the flames could wash away years of cold roads and harsher nights. The keeper finally stirred, rising from her chair in the corner. She didn't welcome him. No polite words, no smile, but she inclined her head in a way that acknowledged power. The rest of the room followed her lead, eyes turning away again, as if pretending he wasn't there would somehow protect them. You tried to relax, to remind yourself that you were only watching, only listening, but your heart kept a steady rhythm of unease. What had brought him here? What did the keeper see in him that froze her tongue? These were the kinds of questions you never wanted answers to in such a place. The brothel itself seemed to shrink as the night deepened. The low ceiling pressed down, the smoke thickened, and the laughter that had once tried to fill the room returned in short bursts, but always with one eye on the stranger. Even the music, a faint plucking of a lute in the corner, sounded hesitant, as though the strings themselves feared to be too loud. You noticed details you hadn't before. The cracked plaster on the walls, patched over again and again, but never strong enough to last. The threadbare blankets hanging over doorways, meant to offer privacy, but really doing little more than muting the sounds from beyond. The wooden cups that held watered wine, stained so deeply they would never be clean again. And behind it all, a sense of exhaustion that no fire could lift. This was not a place of romance. It was a place of survival. And the women here, often spoken of as if they were objects of scandal or temptation, were in truth survivors of the hardest kind. Some had been sent by families too poor to feed another mouth. Some had fled from worse dangers outside: wars, plagues, unwanted marriages. Others had simply found that in a world with few choices, this was the only one left. Their painted smiles were masks, their songs distractions, their presence a shield against the crushing loneliness of the medieval night. You realized, with a kind of slow dread, that you wouldn't have lasted here. Not because of what people came seeking, but because of the weight of it all, the air so heavy with despair, the constant edge of danger, the knowledge that hope was a luxury few could afford. A single night might leave you shaken. More than that, it might break you. The stranger shifted, pulling a small pouch from his cloak and tossing it toward the keeper. The sound of coins clinking together filled the silence, sharper than the crackle of the fire. She caught it without a word, her hand steady, though her eyes flickered with something you couldn't read. A transaction had been made, but you didn't know what it meant. Not yet. Your own breathing seemed louder now, as though the room itself had noticed you. You shifted in your chair, tried to appear calm, to blend into the shadows, but it was impossible. You were not one of them, not part of this world, and everyone here knew it. The night dragged on, the fire burning low, the rain outside, turning into a steady drumbeat on the roof. Voices rose and fell in uneven patterns, sometimes soft with forced laughter, sometimes sharp with anger. A fight nearly broke out near the door. Two men shoving, their words slurred, their hands ready for knives. The keeper's voice sliced through the noise, commanding and sharp, and the tension dissolved before blood was drawn. But the warning was clear. One wrong move, and the night could turn violent. As you sat there, the weight of medieval life pressed in from all sides. This was no stage for chivalry, no tale of noble love. It was the underside of the Middle Ages, the part history books often skim over, the part that lived in whispers and shadows. And it was here, in this dimly lit room, that you began to sense something darker waiting, something unspoken but heavy in the air. The stranger finally looked up, his eyes sweeping the room before landing on you. Just for a moment, no more than a heartbeat, but enough to send a chill through your spine. It was as if he saw you for what you were, an outsider, someone who didn't belong, someone who had stumbled into a place where survival was earned, not given. The room grew quieter again, almost unnaturally so, and you realized that whatever came next would not leave you untouched. This was not a story you could simply watch from a distance. This was a night that demanded something from you. And as the fire dimmed and the sound of rain grew louder against the roof, you wondered if dawn would come quickly enough, or if you would still be there to see it. The hours in a medieval night stretched differently than they do now. Time felt slower, heavier, as though every moment carried more weight than it should. The candles burned unevenly, dripping wax onto wooden tables that had been scarred by countless knives, mugs, and fists. Smoke hung in the air, settling into your clothes, into your skin, until it felt like part of you. The fire in the hearth sputtered, sending sparks upward, as though even the flames were weary of trying to warm such a room. The stranger remained near the fire, his presence shaping the space like a shadow no one dared challenge. Now and then, someone would glance at him, but their eyes always darted away quickly, as if afraid he would notice. He didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't drink. He only watched, and the longer he stayed silent, the heavier the room became. You began to realize that silence itself could be more powerful than any shout. At the edges of the room, the women moved carefully, almost ritualistically, tending to customers with tired precision. Their laughter rose and fell like fragile glass, too quick, too sharp, always on the verge of breaking. They leaned against men whose hands were calloused from field work, whose bodies carried the scent of sweat and mud. Some were gentle, their eyes full of loneliness more than desire, grateful simply to have someone listen for a short while. Others carried anger, frustration from days of labor, and their touches were rougher, their voices harder. The keeper of the house, ever watchful, paced the room with the quiet authority of someone who had long ago accepted that control was the only way to keep chaos at bay. Her eyes missed nothing. The shuffle of coins, the clink of mugs, the sharp inhale of breath when tempers rose too high. She kept her hand near a heavy stick propped against the wall, not for show, but because in this world, force was often the only language people respected. You shifted in your seat, feeling the wooden bench press uncomfortably against your back. Every sound seemed amplified. The scrape of mugs on wood, the cough of a man in the corner, the creak of the staircase as someone ascended to the rooms above. You realized that here, privacy was nothing more than an illusion. Every word spoken in hushed tones could be overheard. Every secret could become a weapon. Every moment of weakness could be noticed by someone willing to use it against you. A man near the door began to sing softly, his voice low and rough, carrying the tune of a folk song that might once have been cheerful. Now it sounded like a lament, each note dragging with the weight of years. The lute player joined in hesitantly, his fingers plucking strings that were nearly worn through. The music filled the room, not with joy, but with a reminder of everything lost to time. Youth, dreams, families left behind in villages miles away. You thought again about the women who worked here. Their faces blurred together in the dim light, but the stories they carried were sharp. Some had once been daughters of farmers, their hands once calloused from harvesting grain before hunger drove them to the town. Others had once been wives, abandoned when their husbands left for war and never returned. A few had grown up knowing nothing else, raised in the shadow of this very place, their childhoods swallowed by the needs of survival. The medieval world did not offer safety nets. If you fell hard, and few hands reached out to catch you. Brothels were not glamorous. They were desperate answers to desperate lives. And yet, in their own way, they became small communities, fragile shelters for those who had nowhere else to go. For all the darkness, there was a strange kind of loyalty among the women, a silent bond forged through shared hardship. They looked out for one another when no one else would. It was not kindness as much as necessity, but it was something. The stranger finally moved, breaking the spell of stillness he had cast. He rose from his chair, his boots heavy against the boards, and walked toward the back of the room. People shifted aside, parting for him without being asked. The keeper followed him with her eyes, her lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. He vanished behind one of the threadbare curtains, and the room seemed to exhale all at once, as though everyone had been holding their breath. A man near you leaned forward, muttering under his breath, though not to you directly. Nothing good comes of his kind. His words vanished into the smoke before you could ask what he meant. You stared at the curtain where the stranger had disappeared, wondering what business he carried, what story he brought into this place. But before you could dwell on it too long, the door opened again, letting in a gust of cold night air. Another figure stepped inside, this one younger, wrapped in a cloak that barely kept out the rain. His hair clung to his face, and his eyes darted around the room, wide and restless. He did not carry the same silence as the first man. He carried urgency, and it spread through the room like a spark. The keeper noticed him immediately, her body stiffening as she approached. Their exchange was brief, too quiet for you to hear, but her expression told you enough. Trouble had arrived, and it was not the kind that could be ignored. The boy, he looked no older than his late teens, shifted nervously, his hands trembling as he pulled something from his cloak. A folded piece of parchment, damp with rain. He thrust it into the keeper's hand, his lips moving quickly, his voice hushed but desperate. The women nearest to him turned their heads, pretending not to listen, but their ears caught every word. The keeper's eyes scanned the parchment, her jaw tightening with each line. When she finished, she folded it slowly, deliberately, and tucked it into her sleeve. She placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, squeezing it in a way that was both firm and oddly comforting. Then, without a word, she led him toward the back, past the curtain where the first stranger had gone. Whispers rose immediately. Men leaned toward one another, speculating in low voices. Some laughed bitterly, others shook their heads. The women exchanged quick glances, their eyes flickering with worry. Something was unfolding, and though you were an outsider, you could feel its weight pressing into the room. You sat frozen, caught between the urge to leave and the fear of what might happen if you did. The door was only a few steps away, but stepping back into the rain meant stepping into a medieval street at night, where dangers were no less real. And here, in this brothel, you sensed that leaving might draw more attention than staying. The lute fell silent. The song ended unfinished. The fire crackled low, and the rain outside grew heavier. You tried to calm your racing thoughts, to remind yourself that this was only one night, that dawn would come eventually. But in the Middle Ages, dawn was never guaranteed. Too many things could happen before the sun returned. And as you sat there, the curtain at the back stirred slightly, revealing a sliver of shadow and the faint murmur of voices you couldn't quite make out. Whatever was happening behind it, you knew it wasn't meant for you to hear. Yet you couldn't stop listening, your body tense, your breath shallow. The night in the brothel had begun as something you thought you could observe, a story from the past to glimpse for a moment. But it was becoming clear now. You were no longer an observer. You were caught in the middle of something larger, something dangerous. And the question pressed harder than ever. Would you last until morning, or would this night claim you as it had claimed so many others before? The curtain at the back remained still after swallowing the boy and the keeper, but the tension it left behind spread like smoke through the room. Men muttered into their cups, their voices heavy with suspicion. A few rose and left, not bothering to hide their unease, slipping out into the rain-soaked streets where perhaps they thought danger would be easier to face than whatever business had entered this house. Others stayed, stubborn or desperate, pretending not to care, but watching the curtain with restless eyes. You tried to steady your breath, tried to remind yourself that this was just another night in a place that lived off uncertainty. Yet every sound pulled you tighter into the moment. The uneven notes of the lute as the musician tried to resume playing, the scrape of boots across the floor, the hollow cough in the corner where an older man sat with his head bowed low. The fire was dying now, burning down to glowing embers. Without its warmth, the dampness of the air crept into your bones, making you shiver. You weren't sure if it was the cold or the fear settling in. Finally, the curtain shifted, and the keeper stepped back into the room. Her face betrayed nothing, but her shoulders were tight, her gaze sharp as she scanned the hall. She spoke to no one, but her mere presence stilled the whispers. The boy did not return with her, nor did the first stranger. Both remained in the shadowed rooms beyond, and that absence was enough to keep the unease alive. You thought of leaving then. You imagined stepping outside, breathing in the fresh air, walking quickly down the wet cobbled street until this place was nothing more than a memory. But the thought unraveled as soon as it formed. The medieval town at night was no safer than this brothel, perhaps worse. Outside, the streets would be nearly deserted, the only figures moving through them drunkards, thieves, or guards who might demand bribes or worse. There were no street lamps, only the occasional lantern flickering outside a tavern or church, casting more shadow than light. The stones of the road would be slick with mud and waste, the stench thick enough to make your stomach turn. Rats skittered in the alleys, and stray dogs fought over scraps with low, menacing growls. And if you wandered too far, you could stumble into darker corners where no one would hear you call for help. No, stepping outside would not free you from danger. It would only change its shape. You stayed seated, listening, watching, waiting. The minutes bled into each other, slow and uncertain. Every time the curtain rustled, your heart jumped, expecting something to emerge. Every time the door creaked, you turned your head, bracing for another stranger with heavy boots and heavier silence. The women continued their roles, moving with weary grace, though their eyes betrayed the same unease you felt. One passed by your table, setting down a mug without a word. Her face was pale beneath the rouge on her cheeks, her gaze quick but searching. She lingered for a heartbeat, as though trying to decide if you belonged here at all, then moved on before you could speak. The music faltered again. The lute player's hands trembled too much to keep the melody alive. He stopped altogether, staring at the strings as though they might tell him what to do next. The silence pressed down heavier than the smoke, heavier than the rain. And then it came, a sound from the street outside. At first faint, almost mistaken for thunder. Then louder, clearer, the steady rhythm of hooves striking cobblestone. Horses. More than one. Their approach was deliberate, not hurried, as if they had a destination in mind and no reason to conceal it. The room tensed as the sound drew nearer. Men shifted in their seats, eyes darting toward the door. The keeper moved swiftly, positioning herself near it, her hand resting against the wall where that heavy stick leaned within reach. The horses stopped. Silence fell, sharp and suffocating. The door did not open, but the weight of whoever stood outside pressed into the brothel all the same. Then came the sound of fists pounding against wood, heavy and commanding. No one moved. The knocking came again, harder this time, rattling the frame. A voice followed, muffled by the door, but unmistakably authoritative. Open. The keeper hesitated only a moment before drawing the latch. The door swung inward, letting in the cold rain and the figures of two men clad in dark cloaks. Their boots gleamed with wet, their swords at their sides. They stepped inside without asking permission, scanning the room with sharp, practiced eyes. The firelight glinted off steel, and the room shrank even smaller. The taller of the two spoke, his voice low but clear. "We're looking for someone." He did not bother to explain who. He did not need to. The keeper's face remained unreadable, her chin lifted slightly in defiance. "This is no place for questions," she said, her tone controlled but firm. The man smiled faintly, though it did not reach his eyes. Every place is a place for questions. They moved farther inside, their presence filling the room with unease. The women drew back, avoiding their gaze, while the men in the room stiffened, uncertain whether to stay or flee. You sat frozen, your hands pressed against the table, trying to appear invisible. The shorter guard's eyes landed briefly on you, studying you longer than you wished. He said nothing, but the silence between you was enough to make your skin crawl. And then, from the back, the curtain shifted once more. The first stranger emerged, his cloak darker now, his expression carved from stone. His eyes met the guards, and for a moment, the air itself seemed to stop moving. No one spoke. You realized in that stillness that whatever was happening here went beyond a simple night in a brothel. Something larger, something dangerous had woven itself into these walls, and you had stepped into the middle of it without meaning to. The rain beat harder against the roof. The fire sputtered, throwing sparks into the air. And you, trapped between strangers and silence, could not shake the truth. Dawn was still hours away, and you might not live long enough to see it. The street grew quieter the deeper you walked into the old quarter. Lanterns flickered weakly, their lights swallowed by the damp fog that drifted in from the river. Horses' hooves clattered on the uneven cobblestones, and you could hear the faint laughter of men disappearing down alleys where only shadows lived. You might think of medieval nights as filled with songs, markets, and celebrations, but more often they were filled with unease. After sundown, the world turned into a place of whispers, hidden deals, and dark trades. To survive even a single night, you needed more than courage. You needed a sense for danger, an instinct sharpened by hardship. The brothels of medieval towns were part of that dangerous landscape. They were not simply places of lust, as our modern minds might imagine. They were hubs of survival, businesses that clung to the edge of law and religion, tolerated only because they answered to certain needs. Yet behind their wooden doors, history tells us of suffering, bargaining, and a constant struggle to stay alive. Women, many of them young and without family or fortune, found themselves inside these walls not because they dreamed of it, but because society had left them with no other place to turn. Some were orphans abandoned by plague, Some were peasants who lost their fields to lords or famine. Others were widows without protection. For them, the brothel was not a choice of desire, but a last option of survival. The air inside such a place would strike you immediately. Imagine the scent of ale spilled over the floorboards, smoke from tallow candles thickening the rooms, sweat mixed with perfume trying desperately to mask decay. There was no comfort here, only pretense. Customers came with expectations, but the women carried burdens that could crush even the strongest. You wouldn't last a night, not because of the noise or the filth, but because of the weight of the unspoken stories pressing against every wall. The church condemned such houses, yet they persisted. Priests preached fire and sin, but town councils quietly allowed brothels to operate, collecting taxes from them in secret. The hypocrisy was endless. You see, medieval towns were built on contradictions: faith and fear, purity and corruption, honor and betrayal. And inside these contradictions, real lives unfolded. A woman might be called sinful in the morning sermon, yet the same men who nodded to the priest might step through the brothel's door at night. What does survival mean in such a world? Could you endure the shame, the judgment, and the silence all at once? Even the workers in these places were not treated as equals to one another. There was hierarchy, just as in the castles and the fields. Some women were forced to pay rent for their very rooms. Others had to give most of their earnings to a madam or keeper, who often grew rich while they remained poor. The younger and healthier were favored, while the sick or older ones were pushed aside, left to struggle even more. Violence was a constant threat. Fights broke out between drunken men. Guards sometimes raided the houses, and the women themselves were often left unprotected. In the face of all this, you realize why a single night could feel like a lifetime. There was no safety net in this world. No laws existed to protect women in these trades from abuse. If trouble arose, the town might punish them rather than those who wronged them. Diseases spread quickly, and without medicine, many did not survive past their youth. Imagine lying awake at night on a straw mattress, listening to the shouting below, fearing who might come through your door next, and knowing there was no escape. Could you close your eyes? Could you breathe steadily? Or would every sound keep your heart pounding in your chest? And yet, within these walls, there were also bonds. Women leaned on each other for survival, forming fragile friendships in the midst of despair. They shared food when one had none, whispered secrets in the dark, comforted each other after cruel encounters. These small acts of humanity were what kept them alive, even when the world outside called them fallen. You wouldn't last a night because you'd realize how much strength it took simply to endure, and that kind of strength was forged only through years of suffering most of us can't even imagine. Consider, too, the customers. Not all were wealthy nobles or knights, as in romantic stories. Many were traveling merchants, tired soldiers, apprentices, even farmers who saved coins from a poor harvest. Some were dangerous, others desperate, and a few perhaps only lonely. Each one brought not just himself, but his world with him. Rumors from distant towns, the stench of sweat and fields, the tension of unspoken violence. A brothel was not only a house of bodies, but a house of secrets. Spies sometimes used them to gather information, thieves planned schemes there, and officials visited despite laws against it. A single night could unravel with countless dangers hidden behind forced laughter and weak smiles. The women themselves knew these secrets. They listened more than anyone else, catching the slips of tongues loosened by wine. They heard about wars, betrayals, scandals, and crimes. Some used this knowledge to bargain for their survival. Others held it silently, knowing it gave them a measure of power in a world where they had none. But power was dangerous. A whisper in the wrong ear could mean punishment or worse. Every word was a gamble, every choice a risk. Would you last a night carrying such knowledge, knowing that silence could protect you, but also keep you trapped forever? Outside, the medieval town moved restlessly. Dogs barked at shadows, bells tolled in the distance, and somewhere, a guard's boot struck stone. But inside the brothel, time slowed. Candles burned low, smoke stung the eyes, and whispers turned into songs of sorrow disguised as laughter. Survival here was not just about avoiding sickness or violence. It was about keeping your spirit from breaking. You wouldn't last a night because you'd see how easy it would be to lose hope when the only thing offered to you was despair dressed as survival. But the story doesn't end in despair. To understand why you wouldn't last a night in such a place, you must walk further past the doorways and into the hidden corridors of history, where untold truths wait. The walls of these houses held more than suffering. They carried the memory of a society's choices, the weight of its failures, and the resilience of those forced to bear it. And as we follow those who lived through it, we begin to see the deeper question. Was the brothel only a house of sin, or was it also a mirror reflecting the cruelty and hypocrisy of the age itself? The deeper you go, the more unsettling the shadows become. You hear the faint sound of someone crying in a back room. You see a door slightly ajar, a candle flickering inside. And as you step closer, the air grows colder, the laughter downstairs fades, and you realize that what lies ahead is more than you expected. The night has only begun, and already you feel the weight pressing in. The question is no longer why you wouldn't last a night. It's whether you can even make it through the next hour. The night drags on in ways that feel heavier than the daylight hours. In the day, you can distract yourself with errands, conversations, or the passing of people through the town square. But when the sun goes down, silence seems to stretch wider, and every sound you hear feels sharper. The wooden beams creak overhead. The draft from the shutters makes the candles flicker, and down below, the mixture of laughter and shouts rises and falls like the tide. You notice how quickly the air shifts, merriment one moment, an argument the next, then a crash of pottery against the floorboards. It is a rhythm of unease, a reminder that nothing in this place is steady. The women move with practiced steps, slipping between tables, pouring drinks, laughing when they must. Yet if you watch closely, their smiles fade the moment they turn their heads. Behind the painted faces and the feigned charm, you catch glimpses of exhaustion that can't be hidden. Some walk with limbs from old injuries. Some hold their breath against the stench of ale-soaked clothing, and others simply keep their eyes low, hoping to avoid drawing attention. You begin to sense the cost of performance, how much energy it must take to play the part night after night. And that is why most of us wouldn't last here. Not because of what is seen, but because of what has to be endured when no one is looking. The keeper of the house, often called a madam, is another figure who looms in this story. She manages the flow of money, the assignments of rooms, and the discipline of both customers and workers. At first glance, she might appear powerful, commanding respect as she oversees everything. But even her position is precarious. The town council expects her payments. The church watches her with suspicion, and local gangs may demand bribes for protection. One mistake, one unpaid debt, and her entire establishment could crumble. The women may resent her control, yet in a twisted way, their survival is tied to hers. This uneasy balance of power is fragile, like glass ready to shatter at the slightest touch. You might expect a brothel to be a place of reckless freedom, but in truth, rules governed every detail. The women were not free to come and go as they pleased. Many had curfews, debts to pay off, or contracts they couldn't escape. Some were told what clothes to wear, what songs to sing, even how to act in the presence of certain clients. Their world was not one of liberation, but of control, layered upon control, until personal choice almost disappeared. Imagine losing even the right to decide when you could rest, eat, or breathe freely. For one night, you could perhaps pretend. For weeks or years, you would crumble. The town outside, meanwhile, viewed the brothel with a mix of scorn and necessity. Men condemned it in public while sneaking in after dark. Women whispered warnings to their daughters about its dangers, while secretly worrying about the day hunger or widowhood might force them toward its door. Children passing in the streets would glance at the shuttered windows, curious but too frightened to linger. And yet, No matter the shame, these places remained open. Why? Because they serve a role no one dared speak of openly. The contradiction was so deeply woven into medieval life that removing the brothel would have been like cutting a thread from a fragile tapestry. The whole pattern might have unraveled. It is easy to look back and judge, to imagine ourselves braver or stronger. But survival is not a choice made in comfort. It is a choice made when every door but one is locked, and the single open door leads to a life of shadows. Would you still step through it? Could you shoulder the weight of being called unclean, of being used yet unseen, of being alive but not truly free? That is the question that lingers in these dim corridors, echoing louder with every passing hour. There are also the stories of those who tried to escape. Some women fled in the night, risking punishment if caught. Others begged for sanctuary at the doors of churches, only to be turned away with sermons about repentance rather than offers of shelter. A few were rescued by family or rare kind patrons, but many who attempted freedom found themselves dragged back or left to starve outside. The courage to leave was real, but so were the dangers of what lay beyond. In truth, escape was not always a doorway to freedom. It could be a pathway to a harsher fate. And then there is the silence. Silence is its own kind of presence here. In between the noise of arguments and laughter, there are stretches where the house falls eerily quiet. During those moments, the creaks of footsteps on the floorboards above, the faint sniffle from someone weeping in a corner, or the steady drip of rain from the roof become deafening. You realize how much pain hides in silence, how much fear lingers in the spaces where no one speaks. It is in that silence where your mind would unravel, because in silence, there is no distraction, only the truth staring back at you. At some point, a church bell rings in the distance, marking another hour of the night. For those in the brothel, the bell is not a call to prayer, but a measure of endurance. How many more hours until dawn? How many more footsteps until the last door closes? Each toll is both a relief and a burden, a reminder that time passes slowly when you are surviving rather than living. You imagine yourself sitting in that room, the straw mattress scratching against your skin, the smell of candle smoke thick in your lungs, and you know already you wouldn't last. Still, there is something that keeps these women moving, something that makes them laugh when they can, sing when they must, and rise again each evening even when their bodies beg them not to. Maybe it is hope, faint but stubborn, that something might change. Maybe it is the bond of friendship and shared struggle. Or maybe it is the sheer instinct to endure, the human spirit refusing to give in, even in the darkest of places. That resilience is as much a part of the story as the suffering, though it is quieter and harder to see. Yet, for every flicker of resilience, there is the shadow of danger. Tonight is no different. A fight breaks out downstairs, louder than before. Shouts rise, furniture crashes, and the keeper's voice cuts through the chaos, trying to restore order. You hear heavy footsteps climbing the stairs, closer and closer, and then silence again. The candle in the hallway guttering low, the door creaking open just an inch. The night is not over, and what waits on the other side of that door may be the reason no one, especially you, would ever last until morning. The door creaks wider, and for a moment, you hold your breath, waiting for the figure to appear. But the footsteps retreat, the sound fading back down the stairs. The candle sputters, throwing long shadows against the cracked plaster. That is the way of nights in this place. Moments of terror that pass as suddenly as they arrive, leaving only questions behind. Was it a drunken guest stumbling in the wrong direction? Was it the keeper checking on the rooms? Or was it someone searching for something or someone in the silence above? You will never know, and the uncertainty itself gnaws at you. That is the heart of survival here, learning to live with fear you cannot name. Morning never seems so far away as it does in the middle of a medieval night. Yet the women who lived through it could not afford to simply count the hours. They had to keep working, keep moving, because rest was a luxury. Those who refused to entertain guests risked losing their food, their place to sleep, or worse. and those who collapsed from exhaustion often found themselves replaced. You begin to see how much of this life depended not on desire or choice, but on the relentless grind of necessity. To understand why you would not last a single night, you must also understand the world outside the brothel's walls. The medieval town itself was a maze of dangers. Streets were narrow, often filled with refuse and animals. Thieves lurked in the alleys, waiting for the careless. Disease spread through water and through touch, and the threat of punishment from the church or local officials was constant. A woman without protection, without family or money, was left with almost no place to go. Work in the fields was grueling, domestic service was scarce, and hunger was always near. Against this backdrop, the brothel became not a place of freedom, but of survival's last thread. Many women who ended up here were barely more than girls when they first arrived. Some were brought in by distant relatives who could no longer feed them. Others were sold outright by desperate families, and a few were tricked by false promises of work in towns they had never seen before. The moment they crossed the threshold, their lives were tied to the house. The younger they were, the greater the demand, and the heavier the burden of expectation. Could you imagine yourself in their place, carrying such a weight before you had even fully lived? That is why you would not last, not because of physical weakness, but because of the crushing sense of inevitability. And yet, not all nights were the same. There were times of grim routine and times of sudden upheaval. On feast days or after battles, the houses filled quickly. Soldiers returned from campaigns with coins in their pockets, merchants from fairs with profit to spend, travelers with needs to satisfy before moving on. These were nights of chaos, when voices thundered and fists sometimes flew. For the women, such nights were both an opportunity and a risk. More guests meant more earnings, but also more danger. A single misstep could lead to violence, and no one would step in to protect them. There were also quieter nights when only a few guests arrived, and the silence stretched long between visits. On these nights, stories were told in whispers. Some women spoke of the lives they once had, of families in distant villages, of childhood games, of harvests in fields they would never see again. Others dreamed aloud of escaping, of starting anew in another town, of finding safety beyond the reach of debt and shame. These dreams rarely came true, but speaking them kept hope alive. And in those small moments, when laughter was real and not forced, when voices softened and tears were wiped away, you could see the humanity shining through the despair. But even hope could be dangerous. The church preached that women in brothels were beyond saving, marked by sin. Townspeople echoed this judgment, treating them as less than human. The more they were cast out, the harder it became to imagine another life. Shame pressed down heavier than hunger, heavier than exhaustion. And so many stopped speaking of escape at all, settling instead for survival day by day. This, too, is why you would not last a night. To feel the crushing weight of a future already decided, with no room for change, that is more unbearable than any straw mattress or smoky air. The brothel itself was a character in this story, its walls soaked with centuries of unspoken histories. Wooden beams bowed under the weight of years, floors creaked with the steps of countless feet, and the air carried a permanence of sorrow that no candle or perfume could disguise. Every surface reminded you of those who came before, those who endured and those who did not. If you stayed there even one night, you would feel the ghosts of that history pressing against you, whispering stories that never ended. Could you sleep under such weight? Could you rise the next morning as though nothing had passed? Outside, the town bell tolled again, and the sound drifted faintly through the shutters. For the townspeople, it was just another hour of the night. For the women here, it was another marker in their endless battle with time. Each chime was survival measured out in sound, a reminder that dawn was closer, but never close enough. And as you sit in the dim glow, the candle sputtering, you wonder what might come before the light returns. The footsteps you heard earlier, will they return? The fight downstairs, will it flare again? Or will silence hold until morning, heavy and unbroken, pressing down until even breath feels like a burden? The truth is, no one could answer those questions with certainty. Every night was a gamble, every sound a threat, every moment a test of endurance. That is why you would not last. Not because of what you would see, but because of what you could never prepare for. The unknowns that stretched across every hour, the tension that never released, the constant edge of fear. It was not simply exhausting, it was soul-crushing. And so, the night continues. Shadows stretch longer, the last of the candles burn low, and the house seems to breathe with you, groaning in its beams, whispering in its silence. You feel the weight of history pressing closer, reminding you that dawn is not a promise, only a possibility. And somewhere in the distance, a new sound rises, slow footsteps on the street outside, steady, deliberate, as though someone is coming closer to the door. Would you dare to stay and see who enters, or would you flee before the night swallows you whole? That choice, too, belongs to those who had no choice at all. The footsteps outside grow louder, echoing against the narrow alley walls. They're slow, deliberate, unhurried, as though the person walking knows exactly where they're going. The women downstairs have grown quiet. Even the drunken laughter that filled the air only moments before now seems muffled, replaced by uneasy murmurs. You can hear the scrape of a chair being pulled back, the sudden clink of a mug set down too hard. Everyone, it seems, is waiting. Then, a fist raps firmly against the brothel door. Not the sloppy pounding of a drunk, not the timid knock of a hesitant guest, but a measured strike. 1, 2, 3. The sound hangs in the air long after the last knock fades. For a heartbeat, no one moves. You can almost feel the women exchanging glances, weighing possibilities. A nobleman? A guard? A thief? Each option carries its own dangers, its own bargains to be made. The madam steps forward. Her footsteps are sure, though her breath hitches just before she lifts the latch. The door creaks open, and the night air drifts in, carrying the chill of damp stone and smoke from nearby hearths. A figure stands in the shadows, face hidden beneath the hood of a heavy cloak. No words are spoken at first. The silence stretches, heavy, until the madam gestures the stranger inside. The figure moves with purpose, not the stumbling gait of someone looking for distraction, but the firm tread of one with business to settle. The women avert their eyes, though a few glance up in quick curiosity. You can sense the tension. The house itself seems to tighten, as though every beam and board leans closer to hear. Whoever this visitor is, they're not ordinary. The stranger speaks at last, their voice low, steady, carrying a weight that silences even the muttering in the corners. The words are not meant for you. Not yet. They are meant for the madam, who listens with an expression carved from stone. You catch fragments, something about a debt, something about silence, something about names best left unspoken. The madam nods once, sharply, and gestures toward the back. Without another glance, the cloaked figure follows her down a narrow hall. The door closes behind them, leaving the rest of the house in uneasy suspense. For the women, this is not unusual. Men with secrets often came to brothels. Some brought letters, some traded coins for silence, some used the house as a place to pass messages under the cover of pleasure and noise. The brothel was more than a refuge of bodies. It was a hub of information, a crossroads where lives touched in ways the outside world could not see. Yet with information came danger. One overheard name, one misplaced glance, and punishment could follow swiftly. You sit there, watching the flicker of candlelight across tired faces. The tension in the room lingers, unspoken yet palpable. Could you endure this, night after night? The fear that the next guest might not simply come seeking comfort, but instead bring trouble too heavy for anyone to survive. That is the truth behind why you would not last, because danger in a medieval brothel was not only within its walls, but also in the shadows it attracted from the world beyond. Upstairs, the silence is heavier still. A woman sits alone on the edge of her straw mattress, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She stares at the floorboards, listening to the muffled voices from below. Her name is never recorded in history books, but you can imagine her there. She is young, perhaps no more than 18. Her eyes already carrying the weight of someone twice her age. She remembers the village she came from, the fields that smelled of wheat in summer, the brother she lost to fever, the day her parents could no longer feed her. That memory is sharp and clear. The moment her future slipped away. She breathes slowly, trying to steady herself, but the sound of the knock still lingers in her chest. Whoever entered tonight may change everything, for better or worse. She does not know which, and that uncertainty is its own kind of torment. Her fingers tremble slightly as she reaches for the single candle on the wooden crate beside her. The flame flickers, reflecting in her eyes. Could you sit in that same room, night after night, not knowing who might climb the stairs, not knowing whether dawn will come for you at all? The brothel is alive with secrets. Every guest carries one. Every woman keeps one. Every deal made in the back room adds another layer to the silence. Yet secrets are fragile things. They weigh heavy, and sometimes, when pressed too hard, they break. And when they do, those inside the house often pay the price before anyone else. The madam returns at last, her expression unreadable. She says nothing of the cloaked figure, nothing of what was spoken in the back. She simply gestures for the women to return to their places, her tone sharper than usual. That is answer enough. Whatever business was conducted tonight was dangerous. The hours crawl on. The footsteps outside fade, replaced by the distant baying of a dog. The fire downstairs crackles low, casting long shadows across the stone hearth. The laughter does not return this time. Instead, the house sits in a watchful quiet, as though everyone is holding their breath. You realize then that this is what breaks a person faster than anything else: the waiting, the constant unease, the inability to rest. You would not last, because your body might survive, but your spirit would shatter under the endless weight of dread. Still, the night stretches on. A woman hums softly to herself in a corner, her voice barely audible, a song from some forgotten countryside. Another mends a tear in her dress with careful stitches, her hands steady even in exhaustion. These small acts, so ordinary, are what keep the house alive. They're the quiet defiance of despair, the stubborn proof that even in the darkest places, people hold on to scraps of normalcy. But normalcy cannot last here. Not when the walls themselves seem to whisper. Not when the footsteps return, this time faster, heavier, with urgency rather than calm. Not when a sharp knock rattles the door again, louder than before, insistent, demanding. The madam freezes. The women glance at one another. A chill passes through the room, though the fire still burns. The air is heavy with anticipation, and every breath feels sharp in your chest. Whoever is at the door now has come with purpose, and this time it will not be so easy to send them away. The question presses in once more. Could you endure it? Could you stand in that room, heart pounding, unsure of what waits on the other side? Could you keep breathing through the fear that every knock might bring the end of what little stability remains? That is the truth of it. The reason you wouldn't last a night in a medieval brothel. The danger is not only in the life itself, but in the endless, suffocating tension of what might come next. And the door begins to open again. The night deepened, and the sounds of the medieval town began to change. The busy clamor of merchants and townsfolk gave way to softer noises, doors closing, shutters being latched, dogs barking in the distance. But in the quarter where the brothel stood, the air did not quiet. It thickened, alive with hushed voices, hurried footsteps, and the faint music of a lute carried from somewhere inside. The building, with its crooked beams and weathered stone, was more than it appeared. To outsiders, it looked like a place of indulgence, but inside it was a stage where countless lives played out in secret, and those who stepped inside rarely left untouched. For the men who came, the brothel was an escape, a place where they could hide from their debts, their failures, their wives, or the endless drudgery of their work. But for the women who worked there, it was a trap. Some had been sold into it, others forced by hunger or circumstance, and a few had chosen it out of desperation for survival. Each carried their own story, and together, those stories wove a net of tension that filled the house like a fog no one could ever escape. The madam of the place, a sharp-eyed woman named Agnes, kept her secrets close. She was neither cruel nor kind, but she had a talent for survival that made her both feared and respected. Agnes knew how to balance the desires of powerful men with the fragile dignity of the women in her care. She had to. If she misstepped even once, the brothel could collapse under the weight of scandal, punishment, or worse. Yet Agnes also knew that the house was more than a business. It was a mirror of the entire medieval town. Its walls held the whispers of merchants making deals, knights confessing fears, priests losing themselves in sin, and travelers spilling secrets they should never have spoken aloud. But it was not only secrets that filled the place. It was conflict. Outside the brothel's doors, the town was changing. A famine had left many hungry. The guilds were fighting for power. And the church, with its strict rules and iron grip on morality, was tightening its hold. Rumors spread that the bishop had his eyes on the house, and not only because he disapproved. Some said he wanted a piece of it, to use its walls for his own purposes. Others claimed he sought to shut it down to prove his authority. Either way, the tension crept into every corner, and those inside the brothel felt the weight of eyes watching them, waiting for a mistake. Among the women, mistrust grew. Some feared that one of their own might betray the rest, whispering to the bishop or to the town guard in exchange for freedom. Others whispered of men who had disappeared after visiting the house, their last known steps leading to the brothel's door. The stories might have been lies, but in a place where fear was constant, lies carried the same power as truth. One night, a stranger appeared at the door. He was not the usual kind of visitor. He wore no fine cloak, no badge of guild or wealth. His clothes were plain, but his eyes were sharp, watching every detail as if he were studying the place. Agnes noticed immediately, and so did the women. He did not drink much, nor did he speak freely. Instead, he asked quiet questions, not about pleasure, but about who came and went, about the bishop, about the merchants who visited. Some thought he was a spy. Others believed he was a man running from something darker. But none could say for sure, and his presence only deepened the unease already growing in the house. At the same time, a subplot was unfolding beyond the brothel's walls. A young scribe working for the bishop had been tasked with collecting evidence of sin in the town. His job was to write down every rumor, every slip of the tongue, every shadow of suspicion. But as he worked, the scribe found himself pulled toward the very place he was supposed to condemn. He would linger near the brothel, notebook hidden under his cloak, listening to conversations that drifted out into the street. He told himself it was only duty, but in truth he was fascinated by the lives inside, by the women who lived in defiance of the bishop's rules, and by the power they held over men who were otherwise untouchable. The scribe's notes began to fill with details, names of knights, merchants, even a priest or two. And with each page, he realized he was holding something dangerous, proof that the most respected men of the town were not what they seemed. But instead of giving it to the bishop, he hesitated. He knew that once he did, the women would be punished, perhaps destroyed. And though he had never stepped inside, he could not shake the feeling that he owed them something more than silence. Back inside the brothel, tensions were climbing. Food was growing scarce, and the women felt the hunger like everyone else in town. Some began to hoard bread or wine. Others made quiet deals with regular visitors to secure protection. A divide was forming. Those who believed they should stick together to survive, and those who thought only of themselves. Agnes tried to hold them together, reminding them that the house only stood because they stood as one. But whispers and betrayals are hard to silence, and the cracks in their unity widened each night. And then there was the fear of sickness. Word spread of a fever moving through the poorer quarters of the town. Those who fell ill burned with heat for days before death claimed them. When one of the women began coughing in the night, panic spread quickly. Was it the fever? Would the house become a place of contagion? The fear alone was enough to make some men stay away, and fewer men meant less coin, less bread, less safety. Survival had never been so fragile. Still, beneath the layers of hunger, fear, and secrets, there was something else. A question none dared to speak aloud. What exactly held this house together? Was it Agnes and her sharp rules? Was it the money that flowed through its doors? Or was it the invisible web of power that stretched from the bishop to the merchants, binding everyone in a chain of secrets? If one link broke, what would happen to the rest? As the nights passed, the stranger who had first arrived quietly became a shadow inside the brothel. He never revealed his purpose, but his watchful presence unsettled everyone. The women wondered if he was there to save them, to ruin them, or to uncover something buried deeper than any of them understood. Even Agnes, who prided herself on knowing every man's weakness, could not read him fully, and the uncertainty gnawed at her, as though the very foundation of her carefully built world was beginning to shift. Outside, the bishop's scribe tightened his grip on his notebook. Inside, the stranger tightened his hold on silence. And in between, the brothel's walls groaned with secrets pressing to be revealed. The night was far from over, and the danger only deepened. The stranger did not speak much, but silence is never truly empty. Silence invites questions, and questions in a medieval town could be as dangerous as open accusations. Every woman in the brothel felt the weight of his quiet eyes, the way he studied the rooms, the staircases, the faces. Some whispered that he was a guard in disguise, sent to gather evidence. Others thought he might be an outlaw hiding from justice, seeking shelter where no one would think to look. And yet, despite all the rumors, no one dared confront him directly. The mystery was more powerful than any truth could have been, and the mystery itself began to unsettle the house. Agnes, ever watchful, began to change her behavior around him. Normally, she spoke with authority, commanding her house like a general. But with the stranger, she softened. She offered him better food when there was any, directed the others to give him space, and even made small efforts to draw out conversation. It wasn't affection. Agnes wasn't known for that. It was calculation. She sensed he held knowledge that could either ruin or save them. And if Agnes was good at one thing, it was survival. The women noticed, of course. They always noticed. One, a young woman named Isabel, grew curious enough to linger nearby when Agnes spoke with him. Isabel had not been in the house long, but she had quickly learned that information was more valuable than coin. She whispered to another, who whispered to another, until the whole house buzzed with speculation. And speculation in such a place was dangerous fuel. It could spark alliances or betrayals without warning. Meanwhile, in the bishop's chambers, the young scribe was struggling. His notebook was heavy with names and stories, secrets that could destroy reputations. At night, when he should have been sleeping, he reread what he had written. He saw the knights who claimed to fight with honor, but visited the brothel to unburden their fears. He saw merchants who cheated their partners in business deals, but spent their profits within those dimly lit walls. He saw a priest's name scrawled among them too, and that name alone made his stomach twist. He should have taken the notes to his master. That was his duty, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps fascination, or perhaps fear of what would happen once those secrets were unleashed. The bishop was no fool. He noticed the delay. He asked the scribe about his work, pressed him for details, hinted at his impatience. And though the scribe bowed and nodded, inside he trembled. He had to make a choice soon. Hand over the book and betray those he watched, or keep it hidden and risk his own ruin. Back at the brothel, the air grew thicker with each passing night. The famine outside meant hunger gnawed at everyone, but inside, hunger was matched by paranoia. The women watched one another with suspicion. Who might betray them to the bishop? Who might curry favor with Agnes by offering her secrets? And in the middle of all this, the stranger remained calm, patient, unshaken by the fear that clung to every corner. One night, when the house had quieted and most of the men had left, Isabel decided to test him. She brought him a cup of watered wine and sat across from him, pretending to be casual. She asked where he was from. He did not answer. She asked if he had family. He gave no reply. But when she asked if he was running from something, his eyes shifted for the first time. He looked at her, not with anger, not with desire, but with something else. Something like warning. Isabel felt it deep in her chest, the sense that she had stepped too close to a truth not meant to be touched. She left him then, unsettled, and told no one what she had seen in his eyes. The next morning, news spread through the town that another man had gone missing. His last known steps led near the quarter where the brothel stood. Whispers began again. Some said the brothel was cursed. Others said the bishop himself was orchestrating the disappearances, removing those who stood in his way. But inside the house, the women exchanged uneasy looks. The stranger had been there every night. Could he be connected? Or was it only coincidence? Agnes noticed the unease and gathered them all in the main hall. Her voice was sharp, her eyes flashing. She reminded them that unity was their only shield. If they allowed fear to divide them, they would all fall. But even as she spoke, she could feel the doubt in their faces. Fear is not so easily silenced. That evening, the scribe made a bold decision. He crept to the edge of the quarter, hiding in shadows, and for the first time, he stepped through the door of the brothel. His heart pounded in his chest. The smells of candle smoke, stale wine, and sweat filled the air. He kept his hood low, clutching his notebook beneath his cloak. To anyone watching, he was just another nervous visitor. But in truth, he was stepping into the very place he had spent weeks spying on. Agnes saw him immediately. She saw most things. She approached with her practiced grace, speaking in a voice that could charm or cut, depending on her choice. The scribe fumbled through excuses, but Agnes was patient. She had seen fear before. She knew he carried something heavy, and though she did not know yet what it was, she resolved to find out. The stranger watched too. From the corner, his eyes followed the scribe, sharp and steady. He seemed to recognize him, though neither spoke. For a moment, the air between them felt charged, as if two opposing forces had silently collided. Isabel noticed it from across the room and shivered. Something was building, though no one could yet see its full shape. The brothel, once only a place of whispers and indulgence, had become a crossroads of power. A stranger with secrets, a scribe with evidence, a madam with control, women with their own silent battles, and a bishop waiting for his chance to strike. As the night drew on, the scribe sat at a table, hands trembling as he tried to appear calm. The stranger remained in his shadowy corner, never looking away. Agnes hovered, patient and watchful, waiting for the moment to act. Outside, the bells of the church tolled midnight. Inside, the air felt heavier than ever, filled with secrets about to collide. And in that fragile silence, just before the next move revealed itself, every soul inside the brothel knew that something was about to break. The church bells faded into the night, but the echo seemed to linger inside the brothel. It was as if the tolling itself had reached into the heart of the house, shaking loose all the fear and uncertainty that had been gathering. The scribe sat hunched over at his table, his hood casting a shadow across his face. His notebook was hidden deep within his cloak, yet he could feel its weight pressing against him, pulling his thoughts toward the danger it contained. He was surrounded by laughter and chatter, but every sound felt distant, muffled by the pounding of his heart. From across the room, the stranger remained still, his gaze fixed on the scribe like a hawk waiting for its prey to falter. He seemed to be the only one who recognized the true importance of the man in the corner. While others saw just another nervous customer, the stranger saw something else, something dangerous enough to draw him out of the shadows he had lived in for so long. The women moved about the room, serving drinks, exchanging whispers, but their eyes often strayed toward the two men. The sense of unease had become contagious, spreading through the house like a quiet fever. Agnes noticed it most of all. She was no stranger to secrets, but this was different. She had built her survival on being able to read people, and yet here were two men she could not quite pin down. One carried himself with silence that spoke louder than words, and the other seemed crushed by a burden invisible to everyone else. She knew that their presence together was no accident. Fate, or something darker, had led them both to her house on the same night, and she could almost feel the shift in the air as though the walls themselves understood that change was coming. The scribe's hands trembled as he lifted his cup, trying to mask his nerves. He had promised himself that he would only observe, that he would not speak too much, that he would not draw attention. But already, eyes were on him. Isabel drifted past his table, feigning casualness, her curiosity piqued by the way the stranger watched him. She had learned to notice the invisible threads that tied people together, and tonight she saw a web forming. The stranger rose at last, moving slowly through the room until he stood at the edge of the scribe's table. The conversation in the brothel seemed to falter, as if the very air had paused to listen. The scribe looked up, startled, and for a moment their eyes locked. It was not a look of recognition, but of realization. Two men who knew that their secrets were not safe anymore. The stranger spoke first, his voice low and steady, but the words were too soft for anyone else to hear. The scribe's face paled, his fingers clenching around his cup. Agnes narrowed her eyes from across the room, sensing the danger but unable to act without more knowledge. Later that night, when most of the visitors had gone, the scribe lingered, still at his table. The stranger had vanished into the shadows again, as though he had never been there. Agnes approached the scribe at last, her voice calm but edged with steel. She asked him who he was, why he had come, what was that troubled him so. The scribe hesitated, torn between fear and desperation. At last, he whispered that he was being watched, that he held information that could ruin men of power, and that he feared the bishop's wrath if he did not deliver it soon. He did not reveal the notebook, not yet, but his eyes betrayed the truth, that he was drowning in secrets too heavy for him alone. Agnes listened, her mind turning. She knew this confession was both a gift and a curse. If she held his confidence, she might find a way to protect her house. But if the bishop learned that she harbored a man with such knowledge, she could be destroyed along with him. The women gathered nearby, pretending not to listen, but their ears were sharp. They knew enough to sense the danger, and their unease deepened into fear. Meanwhile, the stranger slipped out into the night, his cloak pulled tight against the wind. He walked the narrow streets with purpose, his mind replaying the brief exchange at the table. He had confirmed what he suspected. The bishop's reach extended farther than anyone knew, and the scribe was the weak link in his chain of power. But the stranger was not there merely to watch. He had come with a mission, though he had not yet revealed it. Whether he meant to protect the brothel or expose it was still unclear, but one thing was certain. His path and the scribe's were now entangled, and their collision would not remain hidden for long. The next day, rumors spread across the town like wildfire. Someone had seen a hooded figure leaving the brothel late at night. Someone else whispered that the bishop was preparing to act against the quarter, to cleanse it of sin once and for all. Merchants muttered about missing partners, knights avoided the subject altogether, and the townsfolk speculated in hushed voices. Fear had seeped into every corner, and the brothel stood at the very center of it. Inside, the women argued in low voices. Some said they should turn the scribe out before his secrets brought ruin upon them all. Others said they should keep him, that knowledge of powerful men could be their shield. Isabel was among the few who believed that both he and the stranger were keys to something greater. She felt it in her bones, though she could not explain it. Agnes silenced the arguments with a sharp command, reminding them that survival depended on unity. Yet even she knew that unity was slipping. That night, the scribe returned again, drawn by something he could not resist. The stranger was waiting, seated in his corner as though he had never left. The women moved about nervously, aware that something was building. Agnes stood at the back of the hall, watching with narrowed eyes, while Isabel lingered close enough to hear. The scribe pulled his cloak tighter, his notebook hidden, but the stranger leaned forward and spoke softly again. This time, the words were louder. Enough for Isabel to catch fragments. Bishop, evidence, danger. Her heart raced as she realized the scale of what was at stake. The bishop was not merely watching. He was hunting. and these two men carried the pieces of a puzzle that could either save them or doom them all. The room felt colder as their quiet conversation stretched on. The women exchanged glances, uncertain, restless. Outside, the wind howled against the shutters, rattling them like bones. Inside, every soul felt the weight of what was about to come. And then the stranger's hand moved, quick and sure, slipping something small across the table toward the scribe. Isabel couldn't see what it was, but the scribe's eyes widened, his hand trembling as he accepted it. Whatever it was, it bound them together, sealing their fates in silence. By the time the candles burned low and the house quieted, the scribe and the stranger had both vanished into the night. But the unease they left behind remained. Agnes stood at the doorway, staring into the dark street, her thoughts heavy. She had seen power come and go, but never before had she felt her house so close to the edge. The women whispered among themselves, their voices soft but urgent. Isabel alone sat awake long after the others had gone to bed, staring into the shadows where the stranger had once sat. She could not shake the feeling that the brothel was no longer just a house of survival. It had become the center of something much larger, a struggle of secrets, power, and survival that would drag them all into its depths before the truth was known. And somewhere in the darkness, beyond the reach of the brothel's flickering candles, the bishop was already moving his pieces. The bishop's palace loomed over the town like a fortress of stone and shadow, its tall spire piercing the gray sky. Within its walls, the man who claimed authority over every soul in the district sat in silence, studying reports brought to him by his advisors. The famine had stirred unrest, crime was rising, and whispers of sin filled the streets. But it was the brothel that drew his attention most, not because of its scandal that had long been tolerated, but because of the power it quietly held. Men of influence went there, confessed their fears, revealed their weaknesses. If the bishop could control the house, he could control them. If he could destroy it, he could make an example of sin. Either way, he would tighten his grip over the town. His young scribe was missing that evening, excusing himself with vague words of duty. The bishop frowned at the absence. He had noticed the boy's unease, his delay in delivering the notebook of names and secrets. There was no loyalty without fear, and the bishop's patience was not endless. He summoned a guard and gave simple orders. Watch him. If he falters, bring me word. Meanwhile, the scribe himself was moving through the narrow alleys of the quarter, his heart pounding. Hidden inside his cloak was the object the stranger had slipped across the table the night before. He had studied it in private, hands shaking, eyes wide. It was not large, a key, old and iron, its teeth worn with age. But it was no ordinary key. It was wrapped in a piece of parchment on which a single line was written. What you seek is hidden in the bishop's own house. The scribe had barely slept since then. What did it mean? Was the stranger warning him or leading him into a trap? His instincts told him that whatever the key unlocked, it held the answer to the bishop's power, perhaps even the proof of why the bishop was so obsessed with the brothel. But to pursue it was to risk his life. Already, he felt eyes following him in the street, shadows shifting too quickly behind him. Back at the brothel, Agnes gathered the women in the main hall. The night's work was done, the doors closed, but sleep was far from their minds. She told them plainly what she had seen. The scribe, trembling, carrying secrets, and the stranger, silent but purposeful. These men, she said, are not here for pleasure. They are here for something greater. And whatever it is, it will drag us into it if we do not tread carefully. The women exchanged uneasy looks. One suggested turning them both away, cutting ties before the bishop's wrath fell upon them. Another whispered that perhaps the stranger had come to protect them, that perhaps he was their ally. Isabel said nothing at first, but her eyes glimmered with thought. She believed the stranger's purpose was connected to them more deeply than anyone guessed. Finally, Agnes silenced them with a raised hand. "We will wait," she said. "We will watch. And if we must, we will choose sides." But not yet. That same night, the stranger returned, as though summoned by fate itself. He spoke little, but Agnes confronted him directly. "You bring danger into my house," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I do not fear danger, but I must know if it will destroy us." The stranger studied her for a long moment, then replied in his quiet voice, "The danger was here long before I arrived. I only seek to uncover it." He would say no more, but Agnes, though frustrated, saw truth in his words. The brothel had always been a nest of secrets. Perhaps now those secrets were rising to the surface, ready to shatter the fragile balance she had kept for so long. Meanwhile, Isabel approached the scribe when Agnes was distracted. She had seen the key passed across the table, and though the scribe had hidden it well, she asked him about it. At first he denied everything, his fear plain, but Isabel pressed him with gentle words. Finally, he confessed in a whisper. He told her of the parchment, of the bishop, of the notebook heavy with names. Isabel's breath caught. If the bishop himself held secrets hidden within his own palace, then perhaps the power he wielded over the town was not as strong as it appeared. Perhaps he was vulnerable. The scribe swore her to silence, but Isabel knew better than to trust promises in a place built on survival. She kept the secret close, turning it over in her mind, wondering what it might mean for them all. The days grew darker. Hunger gnawed at the town, and sickness crept closer. Each night, fewer men came, and the brothel's income shrank. Fear tightened its hold on the women, and suspicion grew like mold in the corners. When a loaf of bread went missing from the kitchen, accusations flew. When one of the women fell ill with fever, the rest whispered in panic, avoiding her bed, fearing she would spread it. Agnes fought to keep order, but even she knew her grip was slipping. The brothel was a house of survival, and survival made people desperate. In the midst of this unrest, the bishop's guard arrived one evening, knocking at the door with iron fists. The women froze, hearts racing. Agnes herself answered, her face calm though her stomach twisted. The guard announced that the bishop demanded an audience with her the next morning. No charges, no explanation, only a summons. Agnes bowed her head, masking her thoughts, and closed the door. The women gathered around her, their voices trembling with fear. Was this the end? Was the bishop preparing to shut them down, to seize them as examples? That night, Agnes lay awake, listening to the creaks of the old house, the soft breaths of the women sleeping restlessly. She knew the meeting would decide their fate, and yet she also knew she could not walk into it blind. She needed to understand what game was being played, who the stranger truly was, and what the scribe's key might unlock. Without answers, she was stepping into a storm unarmed. In the small hours, Isabel crept to the corner where the stranger often sat. He was there, as always, awake and waiting. She asked him, quietly, what the bishop feared. The stranger looked at her, his eyes sharp in the candlelight. "The bishop fears exposure," he said. "He fears what lies hidden in his own house. And if you wish to survive, you must decide whether to shield his secret or to tear it open." His words sank into her like stones into water. For the first time, Isabel saw clearly what was at stake. The brothel was not merely caught in the bishop's net. It was tied to the very heart of his power. By dawn, the scribe stood at his window, clutching the key in his hand, torn between loyalty and truth. Agnes dressed in her finest cloak, preparing to face the bishop. And the stranger disappeared into the misty streets, leaving behind only questions and the weight of his warning. As the church bells rang in the morning light, the town awoke to another day of hunger, fear, and secrets. But in the shadows of the brothel, every soul knew the time for waiting was ending. Choices would have to be made. And with the bishop summoning Agnes, the first move of the game had already begun. The night pressed heavier as the stories of those cramped halls continued to unfold. The brothel was more than a house of shadows and whispers. It was a mirror of the medieval world outside, only sharper, harsher, and more revealing. The cobbled streets and muddy alleys of a medieval town could be cruel, but inside those walls, cruelty became more intimate. Men entered with laughter, sometimes with coin in hand, and other times with debts in their pockets. Yet they left with faces drained, their burdens either lightened for a moment or deepened forever. For the women, though, there was no leaving. Each night was a trial, each day a reckoning, and survival meant adapting to rules that were unwritten yet understood by everyone. Whispers told of how some women were not from the town at all, but brought from far-off villages by desperate families. Hunger often spoke louder than a mother's love, and poverty crushed bonds of kinship until daughters became bargaining chips. These young girls, barely older than children themselves, found themselves behind wooden doors that locked with heavy bolts. Their eyes often told more than their voices ever could. At first, they cried softly into straw pillows, muffling the sound so no one would notice. But soon they learned silence was safer than tears. The brothel keeper, a woman known only as Mistress Agath, was the one who oversaw it all. Some called her cruel, others saw her as merely practical. She had survived her own years inside such a place, and in her hardened gaze, there was no room left for pity. She claimed to offer protection, but her protection was only as reliable as the coins that passed into her hands. She fed the girls, clothed them, and sometimes shielded them from dangerous clients, but all of it came at a price. In truth, she kept them bound by debt, always owing for food, for shelter, for the dresses that hung heavy with perfume and candle smoke. The cycle was designed never to end. Beyond the keeper, there were guards at the door, not soldiers in gleaming armor, but rough men from the taverns who had seen enough fights to carry scars on their faces. They were hired to keep out troublemakers, though sometimes they were trouble themselves. If a girl tried to escape, these men were the ones who dragged her back. Tales spread quickly of one who once slipped away into the night, only to be found days later wandering hungry by the riverbank. She was dragged back with her hair shorn and her freedom lost forever. From that night on, the others didn't dare dream of running, though in their hearts, they all held fragments of escape. But the greatest threat did not come from outside, nor from the keeper's rules. It came from the world itself, the diseases that traveled through these rooms like invisible shadows. In medieval times, sickness spread like fire, unchecked and poorly understood. Physicians, when they came at all, carried bags of herbs and masks that looked more frightening than the illness itself. The air in the brothel was thick with smoke from tallow candles meant to disguise the stench, but smoke could not hide what crept beneath the skin. Rashes, fevers, and coughs turned a single night of work into a death sentence. Many of the women bore scars from sickness that never fully healed, reminders that their bodies were as much battlegrounds as the streets outside. And yet, strangely, the brothel also became a gathering place of stories. Each visitor brought with him fragments of the outside world. Knights, merchants, even traveling clerics passed through its doors. Some boasted of battles, their armor left at the entrance like a forgotten truth. Others spoke of roads stretching to distant lands, of seas that seemed to swallow ships whole. The women listened not out of desire, but out of survival. Every tale was knowledge, and knowledge meant a chance, however small, of imagining another life. The younger ones clung to these stories, their minds wandering far beyond the smoky rooms. They dreamed of villages where the air smelled of fresh bread instead of sweat and wax. They pictured mountains that touched the clouds, forests where no footsteps echoed, only birdsong. The older women, though, no longer entertained such visions. Their eyes grew hard, their smiles sharper, and they carried themselves like those who had learned the art of endurance. They became mentors to the younger ones, teaching them how to spot danger in a man's eyes before his hand ever reached forward. Survival was an inheritance they passed down, one whispered warning at a time. Meanwhile, in the town outside, rumors about the brothel swirled through the markets and taverns. Some men cursed its presence, claiming it corrupted their neighbors. Others defended it, insisting it kept worse chaos from spilling into the streets. Priests preached sermons against it, raising their voices in crowded churches, yet some of those same priests were recognized by the girls behind locked doors. The contradiction was no secret, But in a world built on survival, hypocrisy was just another part of daily life. The true conflict grew in the hearts of the women themselves. Each carried a private war, a tug between acceptance and resistance. They were bound by debts, by fear, by the iron grip of Mistress Agath. And yet in their silences, they plotted. A glance exchanged between them could carry more weight than a dozen words. Some spoke of pooling coins together, others of finding help from sympathetic townsfolk. But trust was a dangerous thing, for spies lurked everywhere, and betrayal often came from those one least suspected. One evening, as the candles burned low and the streets outside echoed with drunken laughter, a new figure appeared at the door. He was not a knight, not a merchant, and not a man of God. His clothes were simple, his coin pouch modest, but his eyes carried something unusual, a gentleness that felt out of place in such a house. The women noticed, and so did Mistress Agath, though she said nothing. He spoke softly, asking questions that seemed less about desire and more about lives, about dreams, about the world beyond these walls. His presence unsettled the balance, for in his quiet way, he introduced something far more dangerous than cruelty. He introduced hope. That night the air shifted. The women found themselves whispering about him long after he had gone, their words carrying a tremor of possibility. Could someone like him truly change anything? Or was he simply another fleeting face, another thread in the endless tapestry of survival? The candles flickered, shadows stretched across the floor, and for the first time in many nights, the house felt less like a prison and more like a stage, waiting for something to happen. Yet the danger of believing in hope was always the same. Hope could be stolen just as easily as freedom. And as the night deepened, Mistress Agath stood by her window, watching the streets with eyes that had seen too much. She knew the danger of outsiders, the chaos they could stir. She whispered to herself, though no one could hear, "Change is coming." But whether that change would bring freedom, or something even darker, remained uncertain. Would the women dare to reach for that faint thread of hope, or would it tighten around their throats like a noose before the dawn? The answer lingered in the silence of that night, unresolved, waiting for what the next turn of fate would bring. The days that followed felt different, though nothing had visibly changed. The brothels still hummed with the same noises, men stumbling in with coin and pride, laughter forced into the smoky air, the thump of boots on warped wooden floors. But underneath it all, there was a current, like a hidden river flowing fast. The man who had appeared with his quiet questions had unsettled something no one could quite name. The younger women clung to the memory of his voice, repeating his words as though they were charms. The older ones shook their heads, warning against dangerous dreams. Yet even they, in their silence, let their thoughts drift for a heartbeat too long. Mistress Agath noticed. She always noticed. Nothing escaped her eyes, eyes that had once learned how to measure every shift in tone, every nervous glance, every crack in resolve. She knew when her house was running smoothly and when shadows were beginning to gather in corners she couldn't reach. Standing in her chamber, she pressed her fingers against the window ledge and watched the square outside. The town was alive with gossip, merchants shouting prices for grain, a blacksmith's hammer clanging against iron, and the bells of the church tolling hours that meant little inside her walls. But it wasn't the ordinary rhythm of the town that worried her. It was the quiet storm she sensed among the women. They had been too restless lately, too talkative when they thought no one was listening, too quick to look up when the door opened, as though waiting for someone. Hope, she knew, was far more dangerous than despair. Despair kept people obedient. Hope made them reckless. One evening, the man returned. This time, the anticipation in the house was so strong it was almost visible, like smoke curling from unseen flames. He carried the same simple presence, no jewels, no heavy pouch of coins, but the women leaned closer when he spoke. He asked again about their lives, their memories, and what they wanted beyond these walls. A dangerous question in such a place. Some laughed it off, others looked away, but deep down, each one of them had something they wanted. Even Mistress Agath, listening from the shadows of the hall, felt a flicker of the past she had buried long ago. But danger followed quickly. That same night, one of the guards, a man named Rowell, with a scar cutting across his cheek, caught two of the younger women whispering by the kitchen door. They had been speaking about the visitor, their voices trembling with excitement, when his heavy boots landed behind them. He dragged them into the main hall, his grip rough, and accused them of plotting to run. Mistress Agath intervened, her voice sharp enough to silence the room. The women stood frozen, their dreams suddenly exposed like wounds. The tension in the hall was so thick it could not be cut by words alone. From that moment, suspicion hung in the air. The guards kept a closer watch, their eyes sharp, their steps heavier as they paced the corridors. The women, once careful, found themselves cornered by fear. They knew one mistake could mean punishment, yet the seed had been planted. They could not forget the way the visitor had looked at them, not as tools, not as shadows, but as people. That memory burned hotter with each passing night. Outside, the town stirred with unrest of its own. Food prices were rising. Peasants muttered in the markets about taxes, about unfair lords who took grain while their children starved. Men grew sharper in temper, quicker to fight in taverns, more desperate in their dealings. That desperation often poured into the brothel's doors, making the nights more dangerous. Anger mixed with ale, and the women bore the brunt of it. The air was alive with tension both inside and outside the house, and it was only a matter of time before the two storms collided. One night, when the moon was high and the streets outside glowed faintly with lantern light, the visitor arrived again. But this time he was not alone. He carried himself differently, his shoulders heavy as though the burden of secrecy pressed on him. He whispered to one of the older women, his words nearly lost in the hum of voices, but they carried weight. He spoke of something, perhaps a plan, perhaps a way out, but before he could finish, the door to the hall slammed open. Rowell and the other guards stormed in, their faces dark, their hands gripping the hilts of their blades. Mistress Agath followed, her expression unreadable, though her silence was louder than their shouts. The visitor froze, caught between walls that seemed to close in on him. The women looked from him to Agath, their breath shallow, their hearts pounding. Something had been uncovered. The tension swelled to the breaking point. The guard demanded to know who this man was, why he came so often without paying the way others did. Their voices thundered, each word striking harder than the last. The women stood silent, torn between fear and the fragile thread of hope that bound them to his presence. Agath raised her hand for silence, her eyes narrowing on the man. She asked him one simple question: why? Why did he come here, and what did he truly want? The room seemed to hold its breath. Every candle flicker, every creak of wood, every beat of the heart echoed in the silence that followed. The visitor looked around him, at the women who waited, at the guards who glared, at Agath who watched like a hawk. His answer would decide everything. But before he could speak, a crash echoed from the street outside. Shouts erupted. Angry voices carried through the thin windows. The town was alive with chaos. Men were rioting near the square, anger spilling into violence. The sound of steel striking steel, the cry of frightened villagers, the roar of flames. It all rushed into the brothel like a storm tearing through a weak door. The women pressed against the walls, their fear doubling as the noise grew louder. The guards looked uneasy now, torn between their duty inside and the danger outside. Agath did not move, her eyes fixed on the visitor, as though the chaos beyond her walls meant nothing compared to the answer she had not yet received. And in that moment, with the world outside burning and the world inside teetering on the edge, the tension reached its peak. The visitor opened his mouth, the women leaned forward, and the night itself seemed to hold steady, waiting for the words that might change everything. But the answer did not come. Not yet. The sound of the door rattling under pounding fists drowned it out. The brothel stood caught between two storms, the one inside its walls and the one raging outside, and no one could know which would strike first or how much would be destroyed when it did. The pounding at the door grew louder, shaking the very frame of the brothel. Dust trickled down from the rafters, and the candles shuddered in their holders. The women huddled closer to one another, their eyes wide with terror, as if the walls themselves might split open. Raoul and the other guards exchanged uneasy glances, gripping their blades tighter. Mistress Agath stood rooted in the center of the room, her gaze fixed on the visitor as if willing him to speak before the outside world forced its way in. The visitor's lips parted, his voice nearly drowned beneath the thunder of fists and shouts. "I came here," he began, his words low but urgent, "because you are not forgotten, because there is a way." The door jolted again, harder this time, and splinters cracked near the hinges. The guards moved toward it, shouting for silence, but the noise outside only swelled. The smell of smoke drifted through the narrow windows, carried on the sharp night air. Somewhere in the distance, bells rang out, not the bells of the church that marked hours, but the harsh clang of alarm. The town was on fire with unrest, and it was spilling closer with every heartbeat. Inside, the visitor's words burned in the minds of the women. Away? Could he mean escape? Could he mean freedom? Their eyes locked on him, desperate, hungry for meaning, though fear clawed at their hope. Mistress Agath raised a hand, silencing even the guards. Her face was calm, but her voice, when she spoke, was like steel cutting through the air. "You bring danger to my house," she said coldly, "and yet you speak of promises. What is it you really want?" The visitor met her eyes. For a long moment, it seemed as if the air itself froze, stretched taut between them. Then, with a steady breath, he said, "I want to see an end to this. To chains. To debts that bind people until they forget they are human. There are men in this town, men willing to help. But it must begin here." A sharp gasp echoed from one of the younger women. Others shifted on their feet, torn between fear and trembling hope. Mistress Agath's expression did not change, though a flicker of something unreadable passed across her face. Perhaps memory, perhaps regret. No one could tell. The door finally gave way with a crack like thunder. A flood of men burst inside. Villagers, rioters, their faces lit with fury and desperation. They carried torches, pitchforks, and whatever weapons they had been able to grab. Their shouts filled the hall, drowning every other sound. "Out with the whores," one of them bellowed. "Out with the sinners." Another cried, "This house feeds on our hunger. Tear it down." Chaos erupted instantly. The guards clashed with the intruders, blades ringing against crude weapons. Women screamed, pressing against the walls, some shielding their faces with their arms. The fire from the torches cast wild shadows across the timbered ceiling, and the whole house seemed to groan under the weight of the assault. The visitor moved quickly, pulling two of the younger women out of the path of a rider's swing. "Stay together," he shouted, his voice urgent but not panicked. His eyes darted to the door, to the narrow chance of escape, but Raoul and another guard were locked in combat, just beyond it, blocking the way. Mistress Agath did not move at first. She stood tall, her arms folded, as though weighing whether to defend her house or surrender it to the storm. For years, she had ruled with iron control, yet now the storm outside had torn down the walls she thought unshakable. Her gaze swept over the women, frightened, trembling, clutching at one another, and for the first time in many years, her authority faltered. The rioters pushed deeper inside, flames licking at curtains and straw mats. Smoke curled upward, choking the air. One intruder shouted at the women, his torch raised high. "Run while you can. Tonight, this place burns." Another, drunk on rage, swung wildly at the nearest figure, only to be tackled by Raoul, whose scarred face was twisted with fury. The visitor seized the moment. Turning to the women nearest him, he whispered fiercely, "Now, if you want out, now is the time." His words fell like sparks on a dry straw. The women hesitated, their fear warring with the fragile hope that had grown in secret. Some looked to Mistress Agath, waiting for her command, but Agath remained silent, her face a mask of stone. The guards were overwhelmed. The clash of steel and wood shook the floor, and cries of pain cut through the roar of fire. The rioters had no order, but their sheer numbers forced the defenders back. Smoke thickened, burning throats and eyes, and the once lively hall was now a battlefield. A scream rang out. A girl had collapsed near the stairs, her dress catching fire from a fallen torch. The visitor rushed to her, smothering the flames with his cloak. He pulled her up, coughing from the smoke, and looked desperately around for a way out. But every path was blocked, either by fire, by rioters, or by guards locked in combat. The women began to move, slowly at first, then with urgency. They clung to one another, forming a trembling chain, their steps hesitant but determined. Their whispers of fear turned into cries of resolve. Yet still, the question hung heavy. Where could they go? Even if they reached the street, the town itself was drowning in violence. Mistress Agath finally spoke, her voice carrying through the din. "Follow him," she commanded, nodding toward the visitor. The women froze in shock, hearing the words from the one who had always kept them bound. Agath's eyes were cold, but something deeper stirred within them. Perhaps she knew the fight was lost. Perhaps she had always hoped someone might succeed where she had not. The visitor met her gaze for the briefest of moments. Then he turned, leading the women toward the rear of the house, where a narrow passage twisted into darkness. They stumbled through smoke, coughing, their hearts pounding in their chests. Behind them, the sounds of battle grew louder, the fire roared higher, and Mistress Agath's voice shouted commands that were lost in the chaos. The narrow passage was dark, damp, lined with stones that dripped with moisture. It smelled of earth and mildew, but it was a path away from the flames. The visitor guided them, his torch sputtering as smoke followed them down the corridor. Each step felt like a step into uncertainty. The women whispered prayers, clutched hands, and forced themselves forward despite the fear that clawed at their throats. Above them, the brothel shook with the violence of fire and riot. Beams cracked, voices screamed, and the sound of splintering would echoed like thunder. The women stumbled, half blind, driven only by the will to survive. Yet none knew what waited at the end of the tunnel. Freedom? Or another trap? The visitor's voice cut through the darkness. "Keep moving. Don't look back." His words carried strength, but in his own heart, doubt gnawed at him. The town was in flames, and beyond the tunnel there might be only more chaos. But turning back was no longer an option. At last, a faint glow appeared ahead, a crack of light, weak but real. The women quickened their steps, their breaths ragged. The air grew cooler, fresher, promising open space. For a fleeting moment, hope surged. Yet just as they neared the end, a new sound echoed from behind them. Boots. Heavy, relentless, closing in. The guards had found the passage. The women gasped, stumbling forward, their fragile line nearly breaking. The visitor urged them on, pushing them toward the light. But the footsteps grew louder, faster, filled with rage. The narrow walls funneled the sound, making it impossible to know how close the pursuers truly were. The faint light grew brighter, the end of the passage almost within reach. But the women's hope trembled as they realized they would not all make it before the guards closed in. The night had brought them this far, but it was not done testing them. And as the first woman stepped into the cool night air, the clash of steel rang out again behind them, deep in the shadows of the passage. The battle that had begun inside the brothel was not over. It had simply moved to darker ground. Would they reach freedom, or would the tunnel itself become their final trap? The answer remained hidden in the smoke, in the shadows, and in the pounding footsteps that drew ever closer. The cool night air outside the tunnel hit like a wave of freedom, but it carried no comfort. The street they stumbled into was alive with chaos. Smoke curled into the sky, lit red by the glow of burning roofs. Shouts echoed down every alley, villagers, rioters, and guards clashing in a frenzy of desperation. The women blinked in the sudden light, their faces pale, their lungs burning from the smoke. For a heartbeat, they thought they had escaped the worst. But as they looked around, their hope faltered. The town itself was tearing apart. The visitor urged them forward, his voice hoarse. "Stay close. Stay quiet. He led them down a narrow lane, weaving between shadows, trying to avoid the mobs. Yet every corner seemed alive with danger. Men dragging sacks of stolen grain, drunk rioters swinging clubs, frightened townsfolk clutching their children. The night was no longer safe for anyone. The brothel might have been their prison, but the world outside felt like a battlefield. Then came the second blow, sudden and brutal. From the mouth of another alley, a group of men appeared, their faces masked with cloth, their torches burning like spears of fire. These were not rioters fueled by hunger or anger. They moved with purpose, their eyes scanning the street. One of them spotted the women and shouted. The group surged forward. The visitor froze, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt. He knew these men. They were not villagers, not guards, but mercenaries, soldiers for hire, likely paid by someone powerful in the town. Their presence was no accident. They hadn't come to riot. They had come for the women. The women gasped, clutching one another, their fragile line breaking apart. Panic rippled through them as the mercenaries advanced, their boots steady, their blades glinting in the firelight. Mistress Agath's words echoed in their minds. Hope makes people reckless. Now they saw the truth of it. Someone had known of their attempt to flee. Someone had set this trap. The visitors' thoughts raced. Had Agath betrayed them? Or had another force, perhaps the town's leaders, decided that letting the women escape would expose too many secrets? Either way, the truth was clear. The stakes had risen far beyond survival. This was no longer about one night in a medieval brothel. This was about control, about silencing anyone who might speak of what truly went on behind those locked doors. The first mercenary lunged, his torch swinging dangerously close. The visitor shoved one of the women aside, the flame licking his sleeve as he drew his knife. Steel clashed in the narrow lane, sparks flying as desperate strength met practiced violence. The women cried out, pressing back against the walls, their hearts pounding as the fight unfolded before their eyes. But then came the true twist. From the other end of the lane, another figure appeared, Mistress Agath. She emerged from the smoke like a shadow, her face streaked with soot, her eyes sharp as ever. She had not perished in the fire. She had followed them. For a breath, the women froze, torn between fear and relief. Was she here to drag them back, or to save them? The mercenaries paused, recognizing her. One of them lowered his blade slightly and called out, "Mistress, you shouldn't be here. We're told to finish this." His words carried weight, suggesting orders from someone above, even her. Agath's expression hardened. Finish it by slaughtering women who've done nothing but survive. Her voice cut like steel. The mercenaries shifted uneasily, but their orders held them firm. The visitor, bleeding from a cut on his arm, locked eyes with her. In that instant, the two understood one another. Whatever Agath had been, whatever power she once held, she was no longer willing to stand by. Yet the danger only grew. The mercenaries advanced again, their loyalty to coin stronger than any hesitation. The women screamed as torches drew closer, the heat of flames pressing against their skin. The visitor fought desperately, parrying blows, but he was outnumbered. Agath herself stepped forward, seizing a fallen staff from the ground, her movements sharp, practiced, betraying a strength long hidden beneath her cold exterior. The clash in the alley was fierce, sparks flying, shouts echoing against stone walls. The women, once paralyzed by fear, began to move, dragging one another toward the far end of the street, trying to escape while the battle raged. But the mercenaries were relentless. Their leader raised his hand, signaling others to circle around. The trap was closing. Smoke thickened, rising from the burning quarter of the town. The bells tolled again, their clangs frantic, but no help was coming. The town was too far gone into chaos. The visitor and Agath stood side by side now, their breaths ragged, their weapons shaking in tired hands. For the first time, the women saw their former keeper not as a jailer, but as someone who shared their fight. Still, the mercenaries pressed closer, their blades gleaming, their voices mocking. "You think you can run?" One sneered. You'll burn like the house you came from." The women clutched one another, tears streaking their soot-stained faces. The promise of freedom had turned into a nightmare far darker than the brothel's walls. And then came the moment that shifted everything yet again. From the edge of the square, the sound of hooves thundered across the cobbles. A group of horsemen charged into view, their banners fluttering in the smoky air. The mercenaries froze, caught between duty and survival. The visitor and Agath stared in disbelief as the riders drew nearer. Who were they? Reinforcements sent to crush the riot? Or allies who had come to tip the scales? The women's hope flared again, fragile but alive. Yet as the horsemen slowed and their leader raised his visor, the truth became clear. These were not saviors. They bore the crest of the local lord, the very man whose wealth and power had allowed the brothel to exist for so long. The stakes had never been higher. The mercenaries stepped back, bowing slightly to the mounted men, but the visitor knew at once. This was not salvation. This was judgment. The Lord had come not to rescue, but to silence, to make sure no secrets slipped into the smoke-filled night. The women's breath caught in their throats as the horsemen advanced, their armor gleaming in the firelight, their expressions cold. They had escaped one prison only to find themselves caught in another, with no clear way out. And as the visitor tightened his grip on his knife and Agath raised her staff again, the question burned in every heart. Was this the moment their fragile hope would be crushed forever, or the spark that would ignite something greater than any of them could imagine? The answer, like the fire licking through the town, remained just out of reach. The night had grown so heavy that the candle flames looked dimmer, as though the air itself was thick with waiting. The brothel stood in eerie silence, though no silence in such a place was ever natural. Every step echoed, as if the building were holding its breath. Thomas, who had thought he was only a curious traveler, now realized he had become a character trapped in a story much darker than the one he had imagined. He was no longer just learning about medieval life. He was living inside its most perilous shadow. At first, the whispers had seemed like the common murmur of tired voices, but they had become sharper, carrying words he wasn't meant to hear. "He knows," one said, barely above a sigh. "He mustn't leave," replied another. His pulse quickened, not because of the words alone, but because the voices had come from different directions, as though the house itself was conspiring. He began to see the brothel not only as a place of medieval survival, but as a trap where secrets were protected at any cost. In the dim main hall, Master Guillaume finally stepped forward. His voice was calm, but it held a power that could not be ignored. "Traveler," he said, "you have wandered further into the past than you intended. You wish to know why no one would last a night in a medieval brothel. Tonight, you will learn the truth." His words carried both a warning and a promise. Behind him, the women stood in silence, their eyes fixed not with fear, but with expectation, as if they knew what would unfold. Thomas felt caught between two worlds. Part of him wanted to run, to force open the heavy doors and escape into the narrow medieval street. Yet another part of him, the historian within, urged him to stay, to witness, to uncover. He thought of the countless stories buried in the dirt of history, lost because no one dared to write them down. He wondered if this was one of those stories, one that had been left in shadow because it revealed too much. Guillaume moved closer, and the flicker of the firelight revealed scars running along his hands, the kind of scars made not by accidents, but by choices. He placed a heavy key on the table, its iron surface dark with age. "Every night in this house," he said, "a test is carried out. Those who pass survive. Those who fail disappear. You have stepped into that test unknowingly, but you cannot step out until it is finished." The words hit Thomas like a hammer. This was no longer about medieval customs or the hardships of the poor. It was about survival, power, and control. The idea that he had become part of something older than laws or kings filled him with dread. He thought of the phrase whispered again and again since he entered the town: "You wouldn't last a night here." Now he understood. They hadn't meant comfort or morality. They had meant life itself. Suddenly, the women shifted, forming a silent circle around the hall. Some lowered their heads, while others stared openly, unblinking, their gazes both haunting and protective. A hush fell, and then one of them spoke, her voice low and steady. "You've seen too much," she said. "But maybe that is the reason you were brought here. Maybe the night chose you." Her words made Thomas shiver, for they carried the weight of prophecy rather than accusation. The room darkened as if the candles themselves shrank from what was about to come. Guillaume unlocked a small chest that had been hidden under the table. Inside was not gold or jewels, but a bundle of parchment, bound with wax seals broken long ago. He laid it open, and Thomas caught sight of names, dates, and strange markings. They were records of those who had entered the brothel and never returned. For centuries, men of every station had been swallowed by its walls. Merchants, nobles, even soldiers. Their stories had been erased, their wealth and secrets taken, their bodies forgotten. "This," Guillaume said, tapping the pages, "is why this house still stands when others have burned. The powerful need places like this to vanish their troubles, and the powerless are made into shadows." His tone was flat, but his eyes burned with an old rage. Thomas realized this was no ordinary brothel. It was a machine of survival in a cruel society, one that consumed anyone who underestimated it. The weight of history pressed on him. He felt his own name almost slipping onto those pages, written in the same faded ink. He understood the truth now. The brothel wasn't dangerous because of what went on inside its rooms. It was dangerous because of what it concealed: secrets, sins, and betrayals that reached far beyond its walls. It was not only a house of survival, but a house of silence, bound by unwritten laws more powerful than kings. And then, just as the tension threatened to suffocate him, the twist came. One of the women stepped forward, Isabel, the one who had first guided him through the dim corridors. She looked at Thomas with a strange tenderness. "He doesn't belong here," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the charged air. "The night did not call him. I did." Gasps spread through the circle, and Guillaume's hand tightened on the chest. Isabel's confession turned the room upside down. Thomas realized she had orchestrated his entry, not by accident, but by design. He was not a wanderer caught by fate. He was a piece moved on the board by her hand. But why? What did she want from him? Was he bait? Or was he a witness meant to carry a story beyond these walls? The uncertainty was more terrifying than any threat. The night pressed in closer, the fire crackled lower, and the faces around him waited for the next move. He felt that everything, the history, the secrets, the survival of centuries, balanced on what would happen in the next breath. And in that breath, Thomas knew the climax had arrived. He was no longer simply observing the dangers of a medieval brothel. He was living its darkest truth, pulled into a power struggle that had consumed countless lives before his own. The circle closed tighter, and Guillaume's voice thundered with the final choice. If he stays, the old order remains. If he leaves, everything we've built may burn. The story balanced on a knife's edge, the resolution near but not yet revealed. Would Thomas escape, or would his name join the lost? Would Isabel's defiance unravel centuries of silence? The night had reached its breaking point, and the final twist was still to come. The circle in the main hall seemed to tighten until Thomas could hardly breathe. The choice laid out before him was not one he had ever imagined when he first set foot on the cobbled streets of the medieval town. He had come with curiosity, eager to understand the hidden corners of the past. Yet now he was faced with a decision that felt heavier than history itself. Guillaume's words still rang in his ears. If Thomas stayed, the brothel's power would continue. But if he left, the structure that had survived for centuries might crumble. Every eye in the room watched him, waiting as though the weight of countless forgotten lives pressed down on his shoulders. Thomas's gaze met Isabel's. She stood firm, her hands clenched, her jaw tight with determination. She had risked everything to bring him here, to force the night to acknowledge him. In that moment, he realized she wasn't just defying Guillaume. She was trying to break the cycle, to end the silence that had consumed generation after generation. Thomas understood then that his presence was not an accident, but a chance, perhaps the only chance, for their story to reach beyond these dark walls. The hall grew colder, the fire snapping weakly as though even the flames were waiting for his answer. He thought of the parchment filled with names, men who had vanished into history, erased without trace. He thought of the lives within these walls, bound by duty, survival, and secrecy. And he thought of the countless medieval towns where silence was as much a currency as coin, where the weak were swallowed so the strong could endure. It was not only about one brothel, it was about the world it represented. With a voice steadier than he expected, Thomas finally spoke. If this place survives by silence, then it is time that silence ends. History deserves to remember the truth, not the lie. His words echoed through the hall, soft yet unyielding. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, slowly, Isabel stepped to his side, her face lit by both relief and fear. Guillaume's expression hardened, the firelight catching in his eyes. For a moment, Thomas thought he would strike, that the ancient order would defend itself with violence as it always had. But instead, Guillaume lowered his gaze, as if the centuries of secrets he had carried had finally grown too heavy. He closed the chest of names with a decisive thud. "So be it," he said, his voice low but clear. "Let the truth walk out these doors. But understand, traveler, once the silence is broken, it can never be gathered again." The circle of women loosened, some with faces of quiet hope, others with expressions shadowed by fear of what the change might bring. Isabel reached out, taking Thomas's arm gently, guiding him toward the door. Each step felt heavier, as though he carried not only his own life, but the voices of all those who had been lost. When the great wooden door finally opened, the cold night air swept in, sharp and bracing. The medieval street lay beyond, quiet and empty, but no longer ordinary. As he stepped outside, Thomas turned back one last time. The brothel stood in silence, its walls dark and still, yet he sensed a shift within. It was no longer just a house of secrets. It was a story waiting to be told. Isabel gave him a small nod, her expression unreadable, and then the door closed behind him. He walked through the medieval town with a strange clarity. Every crooked alley, every flickering torch, every worn stone seemed alive with meaning. He realized that the danger had never been only within the brothel. It was in the way the medieval world thrived on silence, how survival often demanded secrets, and how those secrets shaped the lives of ordinary people. He thought of how many travelers, merchants, and knights had believed they were strong enough to last a night, only to be consumed by forces they did not understand. When dawn finally touched the rooftops, Thomas stood at the edge of the town, watching the pale light spread across the horizon. The terror of the night had left him shaken, but it had also given him a gift: perspective. He had walked inside a chapter of history that most would never imagine, let alone survive. And though he had escaped with his life, he carried something even greater: the responsibility to tell the story. As he reflected, he realized the truth of the old warning. You wouldn't last a night in a medieval brothel. Not because of the discomfort, the disease, or the dangers of the street, though all of those were real. It was because of the silence, the weight of secrets too heavy for any single person to bear. A traveler could not endure it, for the walls demanded complicity, and complicity turned even the strongest into shadows. Thomas's journey had revealed not only the struggles of medieval women surviving within those walls, but also the corruption and power that fed off their silence. It was a lesson in survival, in humanity, and in the cost of endurance. He understood now that history was not written only by kings or warriors, but by places like this, hidden corners where lives were shaped by forces unseen. The memory of Isabel lingered with him. Her courage to defy centuries of silence had given him the chance to walk free. He wondered what would become of her, of Guillaume, of the house itself. Perhaps the brothel would close, or perhaps it would endure, reshaped by the truth now carried beyond its doors. But one thing was certain: it would never be the same. Years later, when Thomas would sit and tell this story, he always returned to that same lesson. That history is not about comfort or safety. It is about survival, silence, and the choices people made when the world gave them none. And he would end with the same words that had haunted him since his first step into that shadowed doorway. You wouldn't last a night there. For in the end, it wasn't about lasting. It was about listening, about seeing the truth in the flicker of firelight, and about carrying those voices into the future. And that, perhaps, was the greatest survival of all.